A homeless boy called him Dad. But Billionaire never knew he was his own son. She'll live, but she'll never have children again. That was the sentence that shattered a billionaire's heart on his wedding night. Outside, Aspen was drowning in snow. Inside, Ethan Langford, the man once called the man who beat God, knelt on the cold hospital floor, holding his head in his hands, wondering how much more God planned to take from him. A man who had everything: money, fame, power, yet stood powerless before fate. He thought he'd escaped grief, but it had found him again, dressed in white and wearing his new wife's tears. What would you have done in his place? Would you curse heaven? Or dare to love again after losing everything twice? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from, so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you this story. Ethan Langford had everything except peace. At 44, he had built a company worth billions. Yet no amount of power could quiet the emptiness inside him. He had buried a wife and an unborn child 5 years ago, and every success since had felt like a punishment he couldn't escape. When Claire came into his life, she didn't just heal him, she reminded him how to live. Her laughter filled the rooms he thought were forever silent. Tonight, as the snow fell softly over Aspen, he told himself he finally got a second chance at happiness. They left the lodge past midnight, still in their wedding clothes, the kind of tired that comes after too much joy. Claire leaned against him, teasing that he looked like a man who'd stolen the sun. He laughed, the sound strange in his own throat. For a few seconds, he let himself believe that maybe life had forgiven him. Maybe he could be happy without consequence. The car heater hummed. Her hand rested on his, and the world outside looked almost gentle. Then the tires caught ice. The laughter stopped. The wheel jerked under his grip. Claire gasped his name. The headlights swung across the guardrail, and before he could react, gravity took over. The world became a blur of metal and snow and sound. The car rolled once, twice, until everything ended in silence, so thick it hurt. Ethan woke to the smell of gasoline and iron. His head throbbed. His mouth tasted like copper. Beside him, Claire was trying to speak, her voice small and cracked. "Ethan, I can't feel my legs." The words didn't reach him at first. They hung in the air like a cruel echo. He touched her face, whispering she was fine. Everything was fine, as if saying it could make it true. But her tears told him it wasn't. He tried to lift her, but pain exploded down his arm. When the paramedics arrived, he was shouting her name over and over, his voice breaking in the wind. They pushed him aside, loading her onto a stretcher. He tried to climb into the ambulance, but a medic stopped him. "Please, sire, we need room." The doors closed before he could answer. For a moment, he stood there, snow falling into his hair, his breath turning white. The red lights disappeared down the road, leaving him behind with the sound of his own pulse. Hours later, in the hospital hallway, he waited outside the operating room. The world narrowed to the rhythm of machines and footsteps. His hands shook. He could still hear her scream in the crash, still smell the smoke in his jacket. A nurse passed and asked if he was family. He nodded, though the word felt foreign. When the doctor came out, Ethan saw the answer before hearing it. "She'll live." Mr. Langford. But she won't be able to have children. He didn't react at first, just stared at the man's lips, moving. The world muffled like sound underwater. Then his knees gave out. His fingers clawed the wall to keep standing. Somewhere in the distance, a machine beeped. He thought of another hospital, another white room, another heartbeat that had stopped too soon. His mind split between memory and the present, between what he'd lost and what he was losing again. He walked into Claire's room. She was awake, tears sliding down her temples. When she saw him, she whispered she was sorry. He tried to smile, but the muscles in his face wouldn't obey. "Don't be sorry," he said. But the words cracked apart. He sat beside her bed, holding her hand that felt too small in his. Her eyes searched his, looking for something he couldn't give assurance that this pain meant something. He wished he could promise it did. When she drifted into sleep, Ethan stepped into the corridor. His legs barely held him. He pressed his palm against the cold wall. The weight of his guilt finally breaking through. The world spun, and he sank to the floor, hiding his face in his hand. Through the glass window, he could see the ambulance lights still flickering outside. He had watched her leave once, powerless to follow. Now he sat in the same helpless silence, the same cold, waiting for a mercy that never came. He whispered into the stillness, voice rough and trembling, "God, how many times do I have to lose my family?" But the only reply was the hum of the heater and the faint echo of his own breathing. Outside, the snow kept falling slow, endless, and cruelly beautiful. It covered everything, even the sound of his heart breaking. 2 months passed, but Ethan still woke to the echo of twisting metal. Every night, the crash replayed behind his eyes. Every morning began with the same hollow silence. The Langford mansion, once filled with music and people, now sounded like a museum of grief. Claire spoke little, and when she did, her voice seemed to belong to someone else. The crib he had ordered before the wedding still stood in the nursery, brand new, never used. Its wood gathering dust like an unspoken prayer. He couldn't bring himself to move it. Every time he passed the door, he stopped, stared at the outline of what could have been, and kept walking before the pain could fully form. He buried himself in work, hiding behind spreadsheets and calls. In the glass office upstairs, snow fell beyond the window, like static on a broken screen. His company was thriving, his stock up, his face on magazine covers again. Yet, when he looked at the contracts on his desk, the numbers blurred. He couldn't focus. None of it mattered. For the first time, Ethan Langford, the man who once believed he could control everything, didn't know what to do with his own life. He whispered to himself, almost afraid to hear it out loud, "Maybe I'm not meant to be a father. Maybe I'm just meant to lose." When he came downstairs that evening, Claire was sitting in the living room, her reflection flickering against the glass wall that overlooked the mountains. She didn't turn when he entered. She just said softly that she had dreamed of a baby's laugh, then woke up to the sound of her own breathing. He stood behind her, not knowing how to comfort her without lying. The silence between them wasn't angry. It was the quiet that follows exhaustion. He wanted to hold her, but didn't. Something invisible had grown between them, a wall built of guilt and fear. Later that night, she came into his office. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes swollen from nights. He hadn't seen her cry. She said maybe they could still be parents. Not by blood, but by choice. The words landed like a hand on a wound, gentle but deep. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. There was a flicker of light in her voice he hadn't heard since before the accident. He nodded, slowly. Maybe love didn't have to start from birth. Maybe it could begin wherever you decide not to give up. The next morning, they called the Snow Ridge Orphanage. A woman answered, with a warmth that felt almost foreign in their cold house. She said there were many children waiting, and they could visit that same day. Claire smiled faintly for the first time in weeks. Ethan reached for her hand across the kitchen table. It felt fragile, but alive. She squeezed back, whispering that maybe this was how they'd heal. He didn't answer. He was too afraid to believe in hope again. They left before noon. The car ride started quiet, but not heavy. Claire talked about painting the nursery again, about wanting soft colors instead of white. Ethan listened, nodding, though his mind wandered between fear and something dangerously close to peace. The road climbed higher into the mountains, and snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, swirling like memory. The heater hummed. The wipers fought to keep up, and soon the sky disappeared into white. Ethan slowed the car as the storm grew worse. The road signs vanished under layers of ice. He was about to pull over when Claire gasped softly, pointing through the fog. At first, he saw nothing. Then, through the sheet of snow, a small shape appeared, curled at the base of a broken lamppost. He blinked, thinking it was debris, until the shape moved. He stopped the car and opened the door before she could protest. The wind hit him hard, slicing through his coat. He trudged forward, boots sinking deep into snow. The closer he got, the clearer it became. A little boy, maybe 5 years old, trembling so violently his teeth chattered. His jacket was thin, torn at the sleeve. His hair was wet and matted. Ethan knelt beside him, voice shaking as he asked where his parents were. The boy looked up, eyes wide with exhaustion. Mommy said she'd come back. He whispered. I waited. Ethan's chest tightened. Something in that small, broken voice made him forget the cold, forget everything. Claire ran up with a blanket and wrapped it around the boy. Her hands trembling, she held him close, whispering that he was safe now. For a moment, Ethan watched her face, how the mother she thought she'd lost returned in an instant. He lifted the boy in his arms, feeling his weight, his warmth faint but real. The child's head rested on his shoulder as if it belonged there. A truck driver slowed nearby, shouting for them to get off the road. Ethan barely heard him. He carried the boy to the car, and Claire turned up the heater, rubbing the child's hands to bring back color. His breathing was shallow, but steady. She asked his name, and he murmured softly, Liam Reed. Then his eyes closed, his small body relaxing into trust. Ethan looked at him through the rearview mirror. There was something in the boy's face that stirred a strange ache in his chest, something unexplainable, familiar. He didn't know why, but his throat tightened. For the first time in months, he felt something other than pain. He felt purpose. As the car drove back into the storm, the world outside blurred into white again. But inside, for the first time, the silence didn't hurt. It felt like a beginning he didn't yet understand. The night after they brought Liam home, the hospital room smelled of antiseptic and second chances. The boy lay small and fragile against the white sheets, an oxygen line across his face, his skin almost translucent under the fluorescent light. The doctor spoke softly. naming the damages like a list of quiet tragedies: pneumonia, malnutrition, bruises, healing over old ones. Ethan stood beside the bed, hands gripping the metal rail, pretending to listen while every word sliced into him. He told himself it was just empathy, but deep down, something heavier had begun to move. Claire sat near the bed, brushing the boy's hair from his forehead. When Liam opened his eyes, confusion flickered first, then fear. He whispered if he was in trouble, his voice trembling as he said, his mummy always told him he was too loud. Claire broke instantly, tears spilling before she could speak. She turned away, shoulders shaking. Ethan's hand hovered in the air, unsure whether to comfort her or the boy. He finally placed it gently on Liam's blanket. "You're safe now," he said quietly, but the words caught halfway in his throat. They sounded like a promise he didn't deserve to make. Hours later, the hospital fell into its night silence, the kind that makes every sound too clear. The hum of the machines, the faint drip of IV fluid, the distant echo of footsteps. Ethan sat by the bed long after Claire had dozed off in the chair. The boy's name tag caught his eye again: Liam Reed. He said it under his breath, testing the sound like a memory he couldn't place. Something about it pressed against an old part of his mind, the one he had sealed shut years ago. The next morning, he went home to shower and change. As he walked through his office, the quiet of his desk felt wrong. A photograph on the bookshelf drew his attention: a charity event from 6 years earlier. He remembered posing for the picture with a forced smile, standing beside a banner that read, "Langford Dynamics 10, Reed Foundation, Building Brighter Futures." He frowned, the name catching in his chest. He tried to remember the foundation's founder, but his memory refused to help. He sat down and opened his laptop, fingers hesitating over the keyboard. He searched Reed Foundation in his old company emails. There it was, an old thread with his assistant's name in the subject line. Transfer approved, monthly child support contribution, J. Reed. The date was 5 years ago. He stared at it, numb. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. But even then, denial still felt safer than truth. That night, when he returned to the hospital, Claire was asleep beside Liam's bed. The boy's breathing had steadied, and a nurse had placed a small stuffed bear in his arms. Ethan sat quietly, the chair creaking under his weight. He tried to focus on the rhythm of the machines, but his mind was already slipping backward to Boston, to a hotel room that smelled of whiskey and rain. He remembered the night too clearly. A corporate celebration, expensive champagne, too many toasts to success. He had been younger, lonelier, freshly divorced, and drunk on the idea that he could outrun guilt with work. Julia Reed had been serving drinks, her smile kind but tired. She had freckles across her nose and a way of speaking that made silence seem gentle. One drink became 2, then 3. She laughed at something he said, something stupid, and he mistook it for interest. When she looked surprised as he leaned closer, he should have stopped, but he didn't. He remembered the morning after the pale light through the curtains, the smell of cheap coffee, and Julia sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse her. She just looked at him with quiet understanding, like she already knew what kind of man he was. He mumbled an apology. One he'd rehearsed in his head before she even woke up. "I shouldn't have let this happen." She nodded once, calm, resigned. Then she said something that had haunted him ever since. You'll forget me, but he won't forget who you are. He left an envelope on the table before walking out. Cash, a business card, a note that said, "If you need anything, call." She never did. A few weeks later, his assistant mentioned a request for a small anonymous grant. A woman named Julia Reed, single mother, struggling waitress. He signed the approval without hesitation. That was the last time he thought of her. Or at least the last time he allowed himself to. Until now, back in the hospital room, Ethan stared at Liam's sleeping face. The boy shifted slightly, his hand tightening around the stuffed bear. In the dim light, Ethan noticed a thin bracelet on his wrist, plastic, cracked, clearly old. Faded letters spelled out Julia. His chest constricted. He reached out, but stopped halfway, afraid to touch the proof of what he'd done. His throat burned. He leaned back in the chair, pressing a hand to his face. A whisper slipped out before he could stop it. "I paid her to disappear." The words felt like acid, burning on their way out. He let out a low, broken laugh, the kind that isn't laughter at all. For years, he had built towers and legacies, donated millions to fix other people's lives, all while pretending his own sins could be hidden under paperwork. Now the truth sat in front of him, 5 years old, small enough to fit into the crook of his arm. Breathing softly under hospital lights, Ethan watched the rise and fall of Liam's chest and felt the weight of every decision he had ever made press down on him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel powerful. He felt human, and the realization terrified him. The thought of Julia Reed never left Ethan after that night. It followed him home, into his sleep, into the quiet moments when Liam's laughter filled the mansion like sunlight, trying to break through a closed window. Every time he heard the boy say thank you or saw him look up for approval, Ethan's heart twisted. He couldn't stop asking himself the same question: what if he's mine? Days passed with the weight of that doubt. Ethan became quieter, more distracted. Claire noticed, but didn't ask. She was beginning to smile again, painting the nursery, reading to Liam at night. Watching her with the boy filled Ethan with something close to peace and unbearable guilt. One afternoon, while brushing Liam's hair, he noticed a few strands caught in the comb. His hand trembled as he slipped them into an envelope. It wasn't proof he wanted. It was punishment. He sent the DNA sample to a private lab in Denver, then tried to pretend he hadn't. Weeks went by. Life at the mansion began to look normal again. Liam grew stronger. He laughed easily, fell asleep faster, and followed Ethan around the house as if the man were gravity itself. Claire said it was sweet, but Ethan could barely breathe under the weight of it. Each time the boy called him Mr. Ethan. The word scraped against something raw inside him. He wanted to tell him the truth, but didn't know which part of it hurt, more the lie he lived or the life he once abandoned. One evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Claire braided Liam's hair, while Ethan read from a picture book. The flames danced on their faces, warm and steady. Then, in the middle of a sentence, Liam looked up and asked if being good would make his mummy come back. The question broke Ethan clean in two. He closed the book and looked at the boy's face. Small and open, and far too hopeful. "Maybe," he said softly. "She already has. Just not the way you think." Liam nodded, half asleep, and laid his head on Ethan's shoulder. For a moment, Ethan let himself believe it, that love could rewrite the past. Later that night, after putting Liam to bed, Ethan returned to his study. The snow outside pressed against the window like a ghost. His inbox pinged a new message from Denver. Subject line, test results. His hands shook as he clicked it open. The words blurred. Then came into focus. Positive. 99.9. 7% match. He couldn't breathe. The air in the room vanished. He leaned back, pressing his palms against his eyes. But the truth stayed. The boy, sleeping upstairs, the one he had rescued from the storm, was his own blood. His own sin. His own redemption. He thought of Julia's face, of her whisper the morning. She said he would forget her, but the child wouldn't. He thought of every time he had told himself it didn't matter. And now, it was all that mattered. His shoulders began to shake. A sound left his throat half sob, half laugh. For years, he'd been praised as a man who rebuilt what others couldn't, yet here he was, undone by the smallest proof of life. He whispered to no one, "God, what have I done?" The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Claire stood in the doorway, barefoot, wearing the robe he'd bought her after the accident. Her face was pale, her voice too calm. "What is that?" "Ethan." He froze. On the screen, the report glowed like an open wound. He reached to close it, but she was faster. She walked over, her hand trembling as she grabbed the paper from the printer tray. She stared at it for a long time. The silence stretched. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "So this is it. God took my womb and gave me your sin." Ihr Hand shook harder. Ethan rose from his chair, reaching for her. "Claire, listen, I didn't know. Not until now." She looked at him, eyes wide but dry. "You didn't know. You always don't know. Ethan, you didn't know when your wife died. You didn't know what your mistakes cost. You didn't even know you had a child. You just build your empires and call it grief." He tried to speak, but she held up her hand, stopping him. The silence that followed was sharp enough to bleed. She looked down at the paper again, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you know what hurts most? I prayed for a child. Every night. I begged for one. And all this time, God was listening to someone else's prayer." Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came. He watched her crumble. But quietly, no screaming, no wild anger. Just the slow unraveling of a woman realizing the life she thought she built was borrowed. She took a step back, clutching the paper to her chest. Then she reached for her wedding ring, twisting it once, twice. Before sliding it off, she placed it on the table beside the DNA report, the metal clicking softly against the glass. The sound hurt more than words ever could. For a few seconds, she didn't move. She just stood there, breathing unevenly, tears finally spilling down her face. Ethan reached out again, whispering her name. But she shook her head. "Don't. Please don't touch me. You brought your past into my broken body and called it love." He tried again, voice cracking. "I swear, Claire, I didn't know." He swore I didn't. She looked at him like a woman staring at the ruins of her own faith. "That's the problem," she said quietly. "You never know until it's too late." She turned toward the door. The wind howled outside, pushing snow against the windows. Her shadow passed over the floor like a fading light. She stopped once, near the entryway, looking back at him. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to speak, but instead, she opened the door. The cold burst in, carrying her voice as she whispered one last line. "You found your son, Ethan." I hope he was worth everything else. Then she stepped out into the storm. The door shut behind her with a sound that hollowed the air. Ethan stood there, motionless. The fire crackled, throwing light across the empty room. On the table, the wedding ring gleamed beside the printed report. He picked them up, his hands trembling, and pressed both to his chest. His reflection in the window looked back pale, frightened, and small. He whispered into the silence, voice breaking. I found my son and lost everything else. Outside, the snow fell harder, erasing the tracks she left behind. The mansion had never felt so empty. Claire's footsteps were gone, her coat still hanging by the door, and the echo of her voice lingered like smoke. Ethan sat in the living room, staring at the glass of whiskey she never touched. His chest hurt in a way no doctor could fix. Upstairs, Liam lay awake, clutching his stuffed bear, listening to the muffled sounds below. He had heard shouting earlier, words he didn't understand, but feelings he did. Mommy's gone because of me. The thought formed quietly, then settled like frost on his heart. When Ethan finally dragged himself upstairs, Liam's bed was already cold. The blanket was tossed aside. The window cracked open. The wind howled through it, scattering snow onto the carpet. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. His brain refused to believe what his eyes saw. Then panic hit. He ran to the window, calling his son's name, his breath fogging the glass. No answer, just the sound of the storm outside, thick and merciless. He threw on his coat, forgot his shoes, and bolted into the night. The snow cut into his feet like shards of glass. His lungs burned as he shouted, "Liam, please. Son, come back." His voice vanished into the wind. The headlights from the mansion cast faint shadows that disappeared a few feet ahead. Every sound, the crack of branches, the moan of wind became the heartbeat of fear. Down the slope, footprints led toward the woods. Small, uneven, rushed. Ethan followed them, stumbling, falling, getting up again. His hands bled from catching on ice. But he didn't stop. Memories flashed like lightning the day he held the DNA result. The night Claire left. The morning he promised to change. None of it mattered if he couldn't find his boy now. Somewhere in the dark, a child's voice echoed weakly, calling for a mother who wasn't coming. Ethan's breath caught. He turned toward the sound, his legs shaking. He found Liam near the frozen creek, collapsed beside the water. Clutching a piece of paper, Ethan fell to his knees, gathering him up. The boy's skin was ice cold, his lips pale. In his tiny hand was a drawing, a stick-figure family holding hands under a crooked sun. Above them, the words written in uneven letters, Mom, Dad, and me. Ethan's voice cracked as he pressed the boy to his chest. No. No. Please. Not again. He felt for a pulse. Faint, but there. Tears blurred his vision. He lifted Liam, his body stiff with cold, and started running toward the road. Each step tore at his legs. But he didn't care. Snow filled his footprints as fast as he made them. By the time he reached the mansion, his body was shaking uncontrollably. He kicked the door open, shouting for help, his voice breaking into pieces. The staff rushed forward, wrapping the boy in blankets, calling the ambulance. Ethan sank to the floor, holding Liam's hand the entire time. The sirens arrived minutes later, but to Ethan, it felt like years. At the hospital, Time dissolved into fluorescent light and whispers. The doctor emerged finally, his tone steady. The boy will live. Mild hypothermia. He's strong. Ethan closed his eyes, letting out a breath that sounded like a prayer. When they let him inside, he sat beside the hospital bed, watching Liam's chest rise and fall. The boy's face was peaceful again, as if the storm had never touched him. Ethan took his small hand in his own. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "I'm here. Son, I'll never walk away again. You hear me? Never." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the boy's hand. The tears came quietly, unstoppable, falling onto the white blanket like melted snow. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. Snow drifted down softly, no longer cruel. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel cursed. He felt human. His sins had names and faces now, but they also had forgiveness. Small and breathing in a hospital bed, he stayed there until the sun touched the glass, his fingers still wrapped around the boy's. When a nurse came to check the IV, she found them both asleep, one healing from cold, the other from years of silence. The world outside was still frozen, but inside that room, something had thawed. The night after the storm, silence returned to the hospital like a slow breath. Liam was stable, sleeping peacefully in his bed, his small hand still resting inside Ethan's palm. The machines hummed softly, keeping rhythm with the quiet rise and fall of the boy's chest. Ethan sat slouched in the chair, eyes heavy, whispering a melody under his breath. It was the same lullaby Claire once recorded when she was recovering from her crash, a song meant to calm her own fear of never being a mother. He didn't realize that she was standing at the door. Claire's hair was damp from the snow outside. She didn't speak at first. She just watched him, the way his shoulders trembled slightly each time he exhaled, the way his thumb gently traced circles on Liam's hand. The man who had once built empires now looked like a boy who had forgotten how to breathe without guilt. She remembered the anger that had driven her away. But seeing him now, broken and singing the song she once hummed to herself, something inside her began to soften. Ethan turned slowly when he felt her presence. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, but alive. Claire took a step inside, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You remembered that song?" Ethan's voice cracked when he answered. He never forgot it. "It was the only thing that ever quieted the noise in me." She came closer, stopping beside the bed. Liam stirred slightly, then settled again. Claire reached out and brushed the boy's hair from his forehead, her fingers trembling. "It looks peaceful," she said softly. Ethan nodded. He's the only thing that makes sense anymore. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It felt fragile, like glass, catching the first light of morning. Claire looked at Ethan for a long time before speaking again. "Maybe this is my way to love again," she said slowly. "Maybe he's not mine by blood, but maybe he's the reason I survived that night." Ethan closed his eyes, the words breaking him open in a quiet way. He told her everything then, about Julia, about the night he tried to forget, about the payments, the guilt, the cowardice. He didn't spare himself. He spoke like a man who was tired of hiding from his own shadow. When he finished, there was no accusation in her face, only stillness. She sat down beside him, her hand reaching for his graze. For a moment, neither moved. Then she said, "Maybe we can both start over. Not the way we planned, but with what's still left." Ethan stared at their joined hands. His voice was small. "I don't know if I deserve that." Claire smiled faintly, tears pooling in her eyes. "Maybe it's not about deserving. Maybe it's about learning how to love what's left after life breaks you." He nodded, unable to speak. Claire leaned her head gently against his shoulder. Together, they sat there, watching Liam sleep. The storm outside had ended, and through the window, snowflakes drifted softly under the dim hospital lights. For the first time, there was no running, no hiding, no noisy, only the sound of quiet forgiveness. Spring came quietly, the way forgiveness does. The snow that once buried everything had melted into soft earth, and the Langford house no longer echoed with silence. The garden that used to be only decoration now carried the sound of a child's laughter. Liam ran barefoot across the grass, chasing a red kite that danced in the wind. Claire sat by the porch, camera in hand, her smile unguarded for the first time in months. Ethan watched them from the wooden bench he had built himself, his hands still rough from the work. It wasn't the mansion he once imagined, but it was the home he had needed all along. At the base of the oak tree, a small wooden sign stood, carved unevenly by Ethan's own knife. The letters read, "Langford family. Started with a storm." He had made it one morning while Claire and Liam were still asleep. The carving wasn't perfect, but the message was. Every stroke of the blade felt like rewriting his mistakes into something solid, something that could stay. He looked at it now and thought about how strange it was that a life could fall apart so completely, only to rebuild itself in ways you never planned. Claire lifted the camera, calling softly for him to smile. Ethan stood and walked toward them, kneeling beside Liam just as the boy turned to look at him. The child's face was glowing with sunlight and mischief. Ethan wrapped an arm around his shoulders. For a moment, he caught Claire's gaze through the lens. No words passed between them, but everything was said. She pressed the shutter, capturing the first true picture of their family. Later, as the sun began to fade, they sat under the same oak tree. Liam was drawing in his sketchbook, tongue pressed between his lips in concentration. Claire leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, her voice low and warm. "You used to talk about legacy," she said. "Maybe this is it." He smiled faintly. "I thought legacy meant buildings, contracts, things that would outlive me. But maybe it's this. A small boy, a woman with forgiveness in her eyes, and a house that finally feels alive." He spoke softly, as if confessing to the wind. "I lost everything that could be counted. Money, pride, empire. But what I found, I could never build." He paused, watching Liam hold up his new drawing. It showed 3 stick figures, Mom, Dad, and him standing under a bright yellow sun. Above it, in uneven letters, were the words, "No more storms inside our house." Ethan felt his throat tighten, a quiet ache that was no longer pain, only gratitude. He reached out and took the paper carefully, as if it was sacred. Claire wiped a tear before it fell, her hand finding his again. For the first time, they didn't need to say anything to fill the silence. The world had stopped demanding explanations. It simply let them be. That night, when the lights in the house went out, the wind outside moved softly through the trees. Ethan lay awake for a while, listening to the rhythm of Claire's breathing beside him and the faint creak of the floor where Liam had tiptoed to hang his drawing in the hallway. The paper swayed gently under the draft, catching the moonlight. For once, it wasn't a reminder of loss. It was proof of what love could survive. Some storms come to destroy everything we know. Others arrive to rebuild what we were too blind to see. Ethan's story reminds us that pain is not the end, but a passage, a place where love and forgiveness can begin again. Sometimes we lose everything we thought mattered, only to discover the people who truly do. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to believe that healing is still possible. Every share, every comment, every moment you spend here keeps these stories alive and helps others find light after their own storms. Thank you for being part of this journey and for listening with an open heart. Subscribe to Emotional Echoes for more stories of love, loss, and second chances. Until next time, may you always find peace after the rain.